One of the fastest liners on the seas, and arguably one of the most beautiful, sat docked in New York City, awaiting her passengers. Normally, the dock would be absolutely buzzing and bustling, with passengers and crew hustling about getting ready to set sail. But now, the dock was much less packed, and the mood was somber as passengers noticed the advertisement in the newspaper. With a deep swallow, they pushed down the lumps in their throats and pushed onward. Surely, Lusitania of all ships wouldn't be sunk, would she? Welcome to Shipwreck Sunday. My name is Eleanor. Just a quick disclaimer for a younger audience before we dive in. This story may be disturbing to some, so viewer discretion is advised. Okay everyone, let's get into it. Welcome to day 1 of Lusitania Month 2024. We have a fun month of longer episodes planned, so I hope you grabbed a snack. Today we start with Lusitania's construction and early career leading up into her sinking. Make sure to share your love of Lusitania in the comment section below. RMS Lusitania and her sister ship, RMS Mauretania, were built in direct response to the Kaiser class built by the Norddeutscher Lloyd Line. These two ships were planned to be the fastest and most luxurious ships on the North Atlantic, prioritizing a weekly service between Liverpool and New York City. Cunard Line had ducked out of being bought by the American businessman J.P. Morgan and becoming part of the International Mercantile Marine Company like White Star Line was, and so they qualified for a £2.6 million of financial assistance from the British Admiralty payable over 20 years with a 2.75 interest rate. And this is important because the British Admiralty wanted to remain in control of as many British ships as possible, and Cunard wanted to build more ships. They would also receive an annual subsidy of £75,000 and a mail contract of £68,000, so that definitely helped. Cunard used this financial assistance from the British Admiralty in order to build these two beautiful ships, and in exchange, these ships were built in a manner that would make them quick and easy to convert into armed merchant cruisers should war fall upon Great Britain. This included gun mounts being fitted but no guns being placed on the ship, so that guns could easily be mounted should wartime arise. RMS Lusitania was the first of these ocean liners, and named after the Roman province in Western Europe of the same name. RMS Lusitania was ordered sometime in 1904, and she'd be laid down on August 17, 1904 in the Clydebank shipyard of John Brown and Company. Cunard Line differed from White Star Line in that they had more than one shipbuilding company build their ships. They didn't have a contract with one shipbuilder like White Star Line did with Harland and Wolff, and John Brown and Company is one of the 3 main companies that built their ships. RMS Lusitania was designated Yard Number 367, and work began on her immediately. Before we continue with her story, let's take a look at her construction, specs, and design. RMS Lusitania was a big, beautiful ocean liner, displacing 44,060 long tons. Her tonnages were 31,550 gross registered tons and 12,611 net registered tons, and she spanned 9 passenger decks. She was 787 feet long overall, but her registered length was 762.2 feet long. Her beam spanned 87.8 feet wide, she had a draft of 33.6 feet deep, and a depth of 56.6 feet deep. Her height varied depending upon where you took the measurement. Up to the boat deck, she was 65 feet tall. To the aerials, she was 165 feet tall. From the keel to the top of the boat deck, she was 104 feet tall. And from the keel to the top of the funnels, RMS Lusitania was 144 feet tall. She was also unique in that she was the first British 4-funneled liner. The first 4-funneled liner overall was SS Kaiser Wilhelm de Grosse of the Norddeutscher Lloyd Line. She would service the Liverpool to Queenstown to New York City route alongside her sister RMS Mauretania. Let's take a brief look at her propulsion. She was equipped with 25 fire tube boilers that powered 4 direct-acting Parsons steam turbines that produced 76,000 horsepower. This was pretty standard for British warships and was seen as competitive toward the faster, more luxurious German ocean liners at the time. She was designed to maintain speeds of at least 25 knots, though during her trials she was able to maintain speeds of 26.5 knots. Her engines powered 4 triple-bladed propellers, and those would be changed to quadruple-bladed propellers in 1909. The 2 inboard propellers rotated inward, and the 2 outboard rotated outward, with the 2 outboard turbines running at high pressure. The exhaust steam then powered the inward turbines at much lower pressure. This was a very efficient system, and had great results for RMS Lusitania. For paint schemes, RMS Lusitania had a red keel, black hull, and white superstructure, and her funnels were first painted dark black before being painted in the typical Cunard line colors of red with black tips. Her name was emblazoned on the sides of the ship in gold, as well as on the stern alongside with her port of registry, Liverpool. Her UK official number was 124082, and her code letters were HLJW, with her wireless call sign after 1913 being MFA. Her hull space was divided into 13 watertight compartments, and any 2 could be flooded and she'd remain afloat. These compartments were connected by 35 hydraulically operated watertight doors, though there was a critical flaw here. The compartment's sliding doors to the coal bunkers needed to be open to provide a constant feed of coal, and closing these during emergencies was difficult. The ship had a double bottom with the space divided into watertight cells. She was different in that 6 passenger decks were above the waterline instead of the typical 4 in existing liners, making her height quite noticeable. Instead of the typical mild steel used to plate ships, RMS Lusitania was plated with high tensile steel or carbon steel, which is steel with carbon content from 0.05 up to 2.1% by weight. These plates were held together by a triple row of rivets, the first of which was driven in by Lord Inverclyde, one of the founders of Cunard Line. To stay on par with the Board of Trade safety regulations, she was equipped with 16 lifeboats with seats for 1,000 people. Okay, let's take a look at design. The ship was designed by Leonard Pescott, and he was Cunard Line's senior naval architect and designer. John Brown and Company of Clydebank, Scotland would build her, as I mentioned earlier, earning her the nickname of the Scottish ship, since RMS Mauretania, her little sister, would be built by Swan Hunter in England. Interestingly enough, this isn't the first ship named Lusitania, though it is the most famous. The first was built in 1871 and wrecked in 1901, making the name available from Lloyd's for Cunard's purposes. As for passenger accommodations, she could carry a total of 2,198 passengers split into 3 classes. She had berths for 552 first class, 460 second class, and 1,186 third class, being serviced by 850 crew. Both she and RMS Mauretania would be equipped with a wireless telegraph, electric lighting, electric elevators, an early form of air conditioning, and swank interiors. Did you know that RMS Titanic's wireless operator was also the operator for both Lusitania and Mauretania at one point? Let's talk interior design for a minute. Now, there's a lot here. If I'm being honest, maybe even too much detail to go over. We won't get into what kind of nails they used to put in the floorboards, but we will get into the good stuff. When Lusitania and Mauretania hit the seas, they had some of the most bougie interiors that money could buy. Lusitania's interiors were designed by Harold Peto, and he almost exclusively covered the inside of the ship in wood paneling, giving Lusitania a very bright, inviting feel. Passenger accommodations were spread out on 6 decks, starting from the top deck down to the waterline, beginning with A deck or the boat deck, then B deck or the promenade deck, C deck or the shelter deck, D deck or the upper deck, E deck or the main deck, and F deck or the lower deck. Each of the 3 classes had space allotted on these decks, with each being strictly segregated from one another as was standard for the time period. Cunard's main focus was customer satisfaction, and they were proud to uphold that standard. Lusitania's first-class accommodations were decorated in a plethora of historic styles, including her dining saloon, which was grand and beautiful, being designed in the neoclassical Louis XVI style. It was arranged over 2 decks with an open circular well at the center topped by a 29-foot tall dome. Corinthian columns were scattered about the space for grandeur and to reduce uncomfortable vibrations. More would be added later because both Lusitania and Mauretania were plagued by severe vibrations, so much so that some second and third class areas of the ship were just uninhabitable. Having straight prows instead of angled prows also made Lusitania and Mauritania able to plow through waves instead of cresting over them, further increasing rolling in heavy seas. Lusitania was also the first Cunard ship to provide the second class with their own separate lounge, featuring mahogany tables and chairs set on rose carpet. Third class, the breadwinner for shipping lines, had much better accommodations on Lusitania than her contemporaries, featuring private rooms instead of open dormitories, as well as a spacious cafeteria-style dining room with long tables and swivel chairs. The private cabins either served 2, 4, 6, or 8 passengers apiece, and this was seen as a luxury compared to open bunks on other ships. It was spacious and comfortable, and definitely more friendly to lower-income folks than other ships. Lusitania was remarkable for her era, and your support is remarkable for this channel. If you're enjoying this video, leave me a like, subscribe to the channel for more content, and let me know down in the comments section below. Alright, let's get into the sea trials for RMS Lusitania. Lusitania was launched on June 7, 1906, 8 weeks later than planned because of labor strikes and 8 months after Lord Inverclyde unfortunately passed away. He'd been there for the first rivet, but passed away before the last rivet could be hammered home. Lord Inverclyde's widow, Mary, was the one who would christen the ship, with the launch being overseen by a crowd of 600 invited guests and thousands of spectators. Her engines were tested in June of 1907 before she'd go to full-blown sea trials in July of that year. The builder's trial was scheduled for July 27th, with representatives of the Board of Trade, John Brown and Company, the Admiralty, and Cunard aboard the ship. Here she achieved speeds of 26.5 knots over a mile at Skelmorley. However, she was found to suffer from such horrid vibrations that her second class was unbearable to be in. The 2-day shakedown cruise had VIP guests in attendance, and here she would run at speeds of 15, 18, and 21 knots, but not maximum speeds, to see how she ran. On July 29th, the guests got off and 3 full days of standard sea trials would ensue. Over 300 miles, an average speed of 25.4 knots was scored, which was great for the ship, well above the 24 knots required by her Admiralty contract. RMS Lusitania would come to a full stop in 4 minutes over 3/4 of a mile when going 23 knots while applying full reverse, so everything seemed to be going well. Let's talk vibrations. She didn't pass the vibe check, because those vibrations were intense. It was caused by the interference between the wake of the outer propellers and the inner, and it became worse when the rudder was moved during turns. At high speeds, the vibration frequency aligned with the ship's stern, and this intensified the vibrations. The solution was to stiffen the internal areas of the ship, but unfortunately the second class had to be gutted and refinished. Multiple pillars and arches would be included in the architectural design, but I love that. It makes it feel grand and luxurious. Finally, on August 26, 1907, Cunard received their new beauty. However, the vibration problem was never fully resolved, and throughout her lifespan there would be band-aid fixes. Lusitania was the largest ship on the water for a brief period before her sister hit the seas, and we're going to go ahead and let her enjoy that. We could make comparisons to the Olympic class, since historians, armchair enthusiasts like myself, and casual listeners alike like to do that. But we aren't going to do that. We don't need to overshadow Lusitania anymore with a certain ship whose name starts with T and ends with Titanic. Sound good? Let's get into her career before and leading up to the sinking. It's no secret she sank, but sometimes her career is overlooked. It's honestly a hell of a lot more impressive than her sinking. RMS Lusitania moored at the Liverpool landing stage for her maiden voyage at 4:30 p.m. on Saturday, September 7, 1907, captained by Commodore James Watts. She obtained her spot at the pier as the one-time blue ribbon holder RMS Lucania departed. And RMS Lusitania sat at the pier as the largest ocean liner afloat, looking gargantuan to skeptical spectators and eager onlookers. Her departure was scheduled for 9 p.m., and by that time, a crowd of 200,000 people had gathered to watch and to salute her. She left at 9 p.m. to head to Queenstown, Ireland, and here she'd gather more passengers. She anchored once more at Rokes Point off Queenstown at 9:20 in the morning, being joined shortly after this by RMS Lucania, whom she'd passed in the middle of the night. This already goes to show the incredible speed she had because of her unique engine design. 120 passengers were ferried out to RMS Lusitania, and this brought her up to 2,320 passengers heading to New York City. Later, at 12:10 p.m. that Sunday, she started off again, passing the Daunt Rock lightship. In her first 24 hours, she'd already traveled 561 miles. Her daily totals would be 575, 570, 593, and 493 miles before she arrived at Sandy Hook, a barrier split in Middletown Township, New Jersey. She arrived here at 9:05 a.m. on Friday, September 13, 1907, taking just 5 days and 54 minutes to cross the Atlantic, just 30 minutes shy of the speed record held by SS Kaiser Wilhelm II of the Neudeutscher Lloyd Line. Fog had slowed RMS Lusitania down for 2 days, and her engines were still not broken in yet. Hundreds of thousands of excited people awaited her arrival in New York City, eager to see Cunard's newest beauty. They gathered on the bank of the Hudson River from Battery Park all the way to Pier 56. New York City's entire police force had been called out for crowd control, watching 100 horse-drawn cabs that had been queuing and waiting to take Lusitania's passengers. RMS Lusitania would spend a week in New York City, and during the week, she was available for guided tours. These guided tours would close by Saturday, September 21, 1907, when she would depart at 3 p.m. for her return voyage, stopping in Queenstown at 4 a.m. on September 27, 1907, and in Liverpool just 12 hours later at 4 p.m. Her return journey took 5 days, 4 hours, and 19 minutes, delayed once more by fog. Her second voyage would receive redemption. This time, the weather was clear, and Lusitania's engines had their warm-up. It was time for her to shine. She arrived at Sandy Hook on October 11, 1907 in just 4 days, 19 hours, and 53 minutes, earning the blue ribbon for the westbound crossing. Some of you, especially our fabulous younger audience members, might be asking, what is the blue ribbon? So let's take a brief look at it. The Blue Ribbon is an unofficial award given to the passenger liner crossing the Atlantic Ocean during regular passenger service with the highest average speed. You can earn the Blue Ribbon for the westbound or eastbound crossing or both, and it is measured by average speed instead of passage time because ships follow different routes on the Atlantic. The term was originally borrowed from horse racing and didn't become widely popularized until after 1910. After 1935, it came along with the Hales Trophy, which currently resides on RMS Queen Mary II. Of the 35 transatlantic ocean liners to hold the title, 25 were British, 5 were German, 3 were American, 1 was Italian, and 1 was French. 13 of these British ships were Cunarders, as Cunard took pride in the efficiency and speed of their transatlantic crossings. Because Cunard took the efficiency route, White Star Line in general chose to excel in luxury. The longest record holder is the current record holder, SS United States, who took the award in 1952 and remains a blue ribbon retainer. In second place is RMS Mauretania, RMS Lusitania's little sister that we will cover later this month, and she held it for 19 years. The shortest record holder was SS Bremen, and she held it for just 6 weeks. Okay, now that we know what the blue ribbon is, let's get back to Lusitania's second voyage. RMS Lusitania had to wait for the tide to enter New York City harbor, but by then the news of her incredibly fast arrival had already hit the shores, and a fleet of small watercraft with their whistles blaring welcomed her to New York City. She'd averaged 23.99 knots westbound and 23.61 knots eastbound during this crossing. In December of 1907, her younger sister RMS Mauretania entered service, stripping her of her title as largest ocean liner afloat. As if this wasn't embarrassing enough, Mauretania also took the blue ribbon from her sister for the eastbound crossing. The Lusitania did make the fastest westbound crossing after her propellers were switched from triple-bladed to quadruple-bladed screws in 1909, averaging 25.85 knots. She'd briefly take back the blue ribbon, but Mauretania took it right back within the same month of July. Imagine that! Your little sister just comes in and steals the show. That's like your parents saying, "Why can't you be like so-and-so's kid?" And so-and-so's kid just so happens to be your own sibling. The nerve of Mauretania. All jokes aside, Lusitania was still very popular and very successful. If I were a bougie first-class lady back in the day, I'd simply implore that my husband take me on both ships so I could do a comparative study. Both suffered from vibrations due to running on steam turbines instead of compound steam engines, but they were so aesthetically different from one another. Mauretania was dark and gothic with her interiors, while Lusitania was so light and airy and royal like French Revolution-era France. These differences are what made them both so special, unique, and all-around crowd favorites, earning the nicknames of the Greyhounds of the Seas for their quick services, and individually as Lucy and Maury. Now we get into something awesome. The Hudson Fulton Celebration. If you don't know what that is, it's a celebration from September 25th to October 9th of 1909 in New York and New Jersey, celebrating the 300th anniversary of Henry Hudson's discovery of the Hudson River, and the 100th anniversary of Robert Fulton's first successful commercial application of the paddle steamship. The discovery of the Hudson River was vastly overshadowed by the maritime achievements of both men, and thus showed the importance of the river to New York's identity and progress. Organizers of the event used it to not only celebrate the success of these two men, but also the status of New York City as a world city and the achievements of the citizens that lived there. Wealthy and influential New Yorkers like J.P. Morgan and Andrew Carnegie were part of the celebration commission that organized the event, which was planned from 1905 until 1909. It was elaborate and was there to show human innovation, including electricity, which was a huge part of the celebration. Ships and memorials were illuminated over the course of the two-week event, and this includes RMS Lusitania. There were fireworks shows, parades, and even public flights by Wilbur Wright of the Wright brothers, and we'll get into more detail of that now. RMS Lusitania, as well as other ships, participated in the Hudson Fulton celebration, celebrating the different modes of transportation that human beings were capable of creating. Lusitania was there to represent the newest advancement in steamship technology. A newer model of transportation on display was the aeroplane, invented by the Wright brothers and first flown on December 17, 1903. Wilbur Wright brought a Wright Flyer to Governor's Island and made demonstration flights before millions of New Yorkers who'd never seen an airplane before. Some of Wright's flights went right over Lusitania, and he got some amazing photographs of her that still exist to this day. Lusitania would return home after this event, and would move through the rest of 1909 smoothly. 1910, however, did not start out smoothly. I can't imagine the New Year's resolutions of RMS Lusitania or her crew stated that they'd like to be absolutely waffled by a rogue wave. A rogue wave, before we get into it, is an unusually large and unpredictable surface wave that can be extremely dangerous to ships and isolated structures like lighthouses. They are defined officially as waves that are at least twice the significant wave height of waves around it. They don't have a singular cause, but high winds and strong currents can cause waves to emerge to create large rogue waves. Well, one of these mysterious rogue waves would have it out for Lusitania on January 10th, 1910. Remember earlier when I told you her bow was meant to cut through waves instead of right over them? Here's where the consequences of that design choice sink in. She was 2 days into a voyage heading toward New York City when she encountered a rogue wave that was 75 feet high. Her bow was trying to cut through it when the wave rolled right over it and smashed into the bridge. The forecastle deck was damaged, the bridge windows were caved in, and the bridge was even pushed back a couple inches aft. And both the deck and the bridge were given a permanent depression of a few inches. These depressions were scars that reminded her the past was real up until her sinking. She did arrive safely in New York City, continuing on as normal, though she was a few hours late and some of the passengers were a bit shaken up from the experience. After this rogue wave, the next 5 years of her passenger service was uneventful and entirely normal. During her 8 total years of passenger service, RMS Lusitania would carry a total of 155,795 passengers westbound and 106,180 eastbound over 201 crossings on Cunard Line's Liverpool to New York City route. That is a hugely successful career in 8 years. And we hope to be that successful with the support of our patrons. This episode couldn't be possible without our lovely patrons. Thank you all so much. If you'd like to support the channel and future episodes, go to patreon.com/shipwrecksunday to join. Okay, now it's time to spell out the beginning of the end for RMS Lusitania. During the 5 years between the rogue wave and her sinking, RMS Titanic would sink and shock the world, causing RMS Lusitania and ships all over on the water to increase the number of lifeboats they had. RMS Lusitania would increase the number of boats she had up to about 48. Of these, 22 were normal lifeboats capable of carrying 68 passengers, 20 were Chambers collapsible boats capable of carrying 54 people, 12 were McLean Chambers collapsible boats capable of carrying 47 each, 2 were Henderson collapsible boats capable of carrying 43 each, and 14 were life rafts, capable of carrying 20 to 40 people each. She also had nearly 3,000 life preservers aboard. With her life-saving rafts and boats, she could save 3,506 to 3,786 people. That's only if everything goes perfectly smoothly and she's able to deploy all of these lifeboats and life rafts successfully, however. As we know, her operating costs and construction was subsidized by the British government, with the catch that she'd be able to be easily converted to an armed merchant cruiser if needed. There was a secret compartment built on Lusitania solely for the purpose of carrying arms and ammunition, and that will be important when we talk about her sinking next week. When war was declared, the British Admiralty would requisition her as an armed merchant cruiser, and she'd be put on the list of official AMCs. As we know, World War I began on July 28, 1914 with the assassination of Austrian Archduke Franz Ferdinand, and so RMS Lusitania would remain alongside her sister RMS Mauretania on the official AMC list as an auxiliary cruiser in the 1914 edition of Jane's All of the World's Fighting Ships. There's something else we need to discuss: cruiser rules. The 1856 Declaration of Paris laid out the rules for naval engagements involving civilian vessels, colloquially known as the cruiser rules. By definition, cruiser rules or prize rules refer to the conventions regarding the attack of a merchant ship by an armed ship. Cruiser refers to a ship sent on an independent mission, such as commerce raiding. Cruiser rules dictate when it is permissible to open fire on an unarmed ship and the treatment of the crews of captured vessels, and they are contrasted to unrestricted submarine warfare, where submarines attack without warning and do not act to protect crews or passengers. Cruiser rules and whether or not submarines should abide by them was a big question during both world wars. In both conflicts, submarines initially attempted to obey them, but became more vicious as time went on. In essence, cruiser rules state an unarmed ship that is distinct from a warship should not be attacked without warning. Further, the crews and passengers of these ships should be safeguarded in the event the ship is confiscated or sunk. However, these ships, like passenger ships, have to follow certain rules to fall into this safer category. Number 1. They must fly the flag of the country they truly represent and cannot falsify nationality. Number 2, they must stop when confronted and allow the enemy to board the ship to search for contraband. Number 3, they cannot carry military personnel or transport troops. Number 4, they cannot transport munitions or firearms. Number 5, they cannot be armed with any sort of weapon, even as a means of protection. 6, and lastly, they are encouraged to ram submarines to enforce cruiser rules. In the event a passenger ship has been boarded and is found to have contraband, a few things can happen. The ship's contraband can be confiscated, the crew scolded, and they continue on their merry way. The ship could be captured to be used by the enemy or sunk, and in either of these events, evacuation by lifeboat must be allowed, and if there is only crew, then the crew can be escorted by the enemy to a safe port or have their safety ensured in another way. They couldn't just be left in lifeboats unless they had adequate rations, the ability to reach safety feasibly on their own, and navigation equipment. During diplomatic discussions in World War I, these rules were often softened to stopping a vessel with a warning shot, offering the crew time to get into lifeboats and then sinking the ship. The situation gets sticky for RMS Lusitania, since she was unfortunately not following cruiser rules, unbeknownst to her passengers. She was illegally transporting munitions, and we'll really get into that next week. With the outbreak of hostilities at sea and on land, fear spread for ocean liners like Lusitania and other large ships that were still offering passenger crossings during this time. Many ships, in order to save passengers and the vessels themselves, were laid up during World War I, and this is also because there was a dramatic drop in passengers brave enough to cross the Atlantic. Some became troop ships or hospital ships, like HMT Mauretania or HMHS Aquitania. However, for some reason, RMS Lusitania remained in passenger service and her bookings were quite low during the fall and winter of 1914 into early 1915. There was still enough demand to keep her running at lower capacity, and to save money, they shut down her number 4 boiler room to conserve coal and crew costs. This took her maximum speed down to 21 knots. Apparent dangers seemed to be evaporating, and so her conservative paint scheme was dropped and she returned to civilian colors. Her name was reprinted in gold with a golden colored band around the base of the superstructure just above the black paint, and her funnels were painted red and black, and her superstructure was painted a brilliant white once more. However, this relaxed feeling wouldn't remain, as early on in 1915 a new threat began to show itself: submarines. On February 4, 1915, Germany declared that the seas around Great Britain and Ireland were now a war zone. This meant, after February 18th, any ships in the area would be sunk without warning, disregarding the cruiser rules. This wasn't defined as unrestricted submarine warfare because efforts were going to be taken to avoid sinking neutral ships. But passenger craft that were British or any of her allies were fair game, and this was despite the fact that the United States demanded, quote, strict accountability. Going against cruiser rules once more, Lusitania arrived in Liverpool on February 6, 1915, flying the U.S. ensign, which was neutral at this point in the war. This had been raised off Southern Ireland, causing rumblings throughout Europe. The sinking of RMS Lusitania, and particularly passenger ships in 1917, would be the thing that finally brought America into World War I, but we aren't going to focus on that today. We know exactly when her next scheduled voyage took place, and she was to arrive in Liverpool on March 6, 1915. The British Admiralty issued specific orders to her and her crew on how to avoid German submarines. Admiral Henry Oliver ordered HMS Laverock and HMS Lewis to escort her, and he took an even further precaution by sending the Q ship HMS Lyons to patrol Liverpool Bay. However, due to an issue in communication, Captain Daniel Dow of Lusitania didn't contact the destroyers and proceeded to Liverpool unaccompanied. He's lucky they weren't sunk that voyage. After this colossal mess-up, her protocols were altered. She was ordered not to fly any particular flags in the war zone, and her funnels were painted gray to disguise her from submarines and obscure the fact that she was a Cunarder. However, there was no hope of disguising the enormous vessel, since her name was not painted over on the bow, and her profile was incredibly iconic. Captain Dow would be replaced by Lusitania's final captain, Captain William Thomas Turner. He was familiar with Lusitania as he'd captained her, Mauretania, and Aquitania prior to World War I. He was knowledgeable and a very brave man. Other than the sinking of Lusitania, the man was also known for saving a man and a young boy who'd fallen in the water after the Alice Davies wrecked in a collision with his ship Cherbourg. He also rescued a teenage boy when he'd fallen from the Alexandra dock, and he rescued half the crew of the West Point in 1910. So this man knew no fear and only honor and duty. Captain Turner and RMS Lusitania left Liverpool on April 17, 1915, on her 201st transatlantic voyage, and they'd arrive safely in New York City on April 24th. Before their arrival on April 22nd, the German embassy submitted a warning advertisement in 50 newspapers regarding Lusitania after being spurred on by concerned citizens. This advertisement was also posted in New York and in New York newspapers, warning citizens that Lusitania was a British ship, and there was conflict between Germany and Britain that put the ship on German submarines' radars. I'll read it to you verbatim since they say it better than I ever could. It reads, quote, "Notice. Travelers intending to embark on the Atlantic voyage are reminded that a state of war exists between Germany and her allies and Great Britain and her allies. That the zone of war includes the waters adjacent to the British Isles. That in accordance with the formal notice given by the Imperial German government, vessels flying the flag of Great Britain or of any of her allies are liable to destruction in those waters, and that travelers sailing in the war zone on ships of Great Britain or her allies do so at their own risk. Imperial German Embassy." That's pretty cut and dry in my opinion. If I read that, whatever business I had waiting for me in Liverpool could wait. I wouldn't want to risk my life or my family's life trying to make that crossing during wartime. The risk of submarine attack would be terrifying, and as we will see next week, it came at great cost. Despite these warnings, RMS Lusitania would depart Pier 54 in New York City for the last time on May 1st, 1915 at 12:20 p.m. with 1,266 passengers and 696 crew aboard for a total of 1,962 people. Of these people, most of them were British or Canadian, and 128 were American. Her first class was underbooked at 290. Her second class was vastly overbooked at 601, and so the overflow slept in empty first-class cabins, and the third class had 373, which was normal for an eastbound crossing. None of these people ever thought this voyage could be their last. Captain Turner, affectionately nicknamed Bowler Bill for his favorite choice of hat, attempted to soothe passengers, assuring them that Lusitania's speed made her much safer from submarine attacks. Even with her speed only at 21 knots, she was much faster than any U-boat, meaning she'd have to be very close to a U-boat for there to be a successful attack. Unfortunately, like Icarus, she'd fly too close to the sun and get burned. Most of the voyage was rather uneventful. The most eventful part of it was that early into the voyage, 3 German-speaking men were discovered in a steward's pantry. Detective Inspector William Pierpoint of the Liverpool Police was on board disguised as a first-class passenger, and he interrogated the 3 men before locking them in cells for further questioning after she'd dock in Liverpool. There was another potential German loyalist, an Englishman named Neil Leach, who was a crew member, and he'd been working as a tutor in Germany before World War I. Leach had been interned, but was released by Germany, and the German embassy in America was warned that he was in the country, so he met with German agents there. This means the 3 stowaways and Leach were probably spying on RMS Lusitania and her cargo, and all 4 went down with the ship. Pierpoint survived the sinking, and he probably knew about Leach, and so that's why he was there in the first place. She made it across the bulk of the Atlantic with no issues, and she made it 6 days into her 202nd voyage with no sign of U-boats. She was 2 hours behind schedule because of a last-minute transfer of 41 passengers and crew from the recently requisitioned SS Cameronia. At the same time, SMU-20 of the Imperial German Navy lurked in British waters, awaiting the perfect target. Let's take a look at SMU-20 real quick, shall we? SMU-20 was a Type U-19 submarine built for the Imperial German Navy in 1911 and completed in 1912. She was 210 feet and 6 inches long, had a beam of 20 feet wide, and a height of 23 and 11 inches tall, and a draft of 11 feet and 9 inches, displacing 640 long tons surfaced and 824 long tons submerged. She could reach speeds of 15.4 knots surfaced and 9.5 knots submerged. On May 7, 1915, she was patrolling off the southern coast of Ireland, and she was commanded by Kapitan Lieutenant Walter Schweiger. Earlier in the year, when Germany had declared British waters unsafe, they formed an underwater submarine blockade around the British Isles and declared any vessel as a legitimate target. As she made her regular rounds, she sighted RMS Lusitania sailing off the old head of Kinsale. They were low on fuel and only had 3 torpedoes left, looking to take down 1 more ship before heading back to port to resupply. RMS Lusitania was scheduled to dock at Prince's Landing Stage later that afternoon, but she'd never make it. At 1:40 p.m., Schweiger was looking down the periscope when he noticed RMS Lusitania, with her 4 funnels pouring out smoke and steam as she chugged along toward Liverpool. Instantly, he recognized Lusitania of the British Fleet Reserve, and therefore a legitimate target. He turned to his comrades and nodded, giving the order to shoot her down. The lookout looked about at the cool, deep blue sea. They were just off the coast of Ireland, and it was a beautiful, clear, sunny day in May. He watched attentively, knowing this area was a war zone. Speaking of war zone, he peered out off the starboard side as something caught his eye. 2 thin streams of bubbles zipping toward the ship. His heart pounded and he grabbed his megaphone, wetting his lips and clearing his throat to give the warning. There was no stopping it, but he could at least let the rest of the crew know. There was a torpedo on its way. Schweiger watched in dismay as the ship he was hunting, RMS Lusitania, was only 2 nautical miles away when she turned away. He feared he lost her, watching his glory and pride sail off into the distance. After a short distance, she turned back toward him, and now was his chance. RMS Lusitania was traveling at high speeds and turning away from the shore, though zigzagging was advised by the British Admiralty and was thought to keep ships safe against U-boats. Lusitania did not zigzag, and maybe that could have saved her, maybe it wouldn't have. RMS Lusitania was lined up almost exactly where Schweiger wanted her, and at 2:10 p.m., with Lusitania less than half a mile away, he gave the order. One gyroscopic torpedo was to be fired at a depth of 3 meters. The torpedo launched with a flurry of bubbles behind it. 18-year-old lookout Leslie Morton spotted thin lines of foam racing toward the ship in the water, and he shouted through a megaphone, "Torpedoes coming on the starboard side." He'd thought there were multiple torpedoes, not just one. The torpedoes struck Lusitania just behind the bridge on the starboard side, sending an enormous plume of water upward that knocked Lifeboat 5 off its davits. A geyser of coal smoke, cinders, steel plating, and debris flew into the air high above the deck. Even the Germans noted how dramatic and much larger this explosion was compared to typical torpedo hits. This is possibly because it might have hit that secret ammo compartment I told you about last week, but more than likely it just struck the boilers, and that cold water hitting the boilers made it explode. And after this, a second explosion rang out, much larger and ringing in everyone's ears. Thick, gray smoke poured out of her funnels and the cowl vents, coming from deep within the belly of the ship. According to Schweiger, he'd only launched one torpedo, and therefore this second explosion is probably from cold water touching the hot boilers and causing an explosion. Some doubt the validity of his claim, stating that the German government altered his logs, though the testimony of other U-20 crew members corroborate his side of the story, and the intercepted radio reports sent to Germany by U-20 were also consistent with this, and this was long before a cover-up could take place. Some historians argue there was a second torpedo, and I honestly thought that for a long time myself. However, to me, the evidence is irrefutable. Her wreck shows a large amount of explosive ammunition near where the torpedo struck, and it's well known that boilers will explode when cold water touches a hot boiler. This ammunition also means that she was going against cruiser rules, making this sinking legal. We do have to note the location of the torpedo hit is debated. Schweiger states the torpedo struck beneath the bridge, though survivor testimonies, including that of Captain Turner, state other locations. Some stated it hit between the first and second funnels, some say between the third and fourth funnels, and one was firm in their belief it struck below the capstan. A capstan, for those unaware, is a vertical axled rotating machine developed for use on sailing ships in particular to multiply the pulling force of seamen when hauling ropes, cables, and hawsers. It's similar to a windlass, though those are on a horizontal axle. It sounded like a million-ton hammer hitting a steam boiler 100 feet high, one passenger would be quoted after the sinking in regards to the impact and subsequent explosions. Because of the devastating explosions, a massive hole was torn open in the side of RMS Lusitania. During the sinking, the rivets would start popping off the steel plating in this area, widening the hole and furthering the devastation. Many in the boiler rooms have already died at this point from the explosions and torpedo impact itself, and this ship will sink incredibly fast, giving little room for mistakes and little time for evacuation. At this point, my friends, we start an 18-minute timer. That's how long RMS Lusitania has left before she disappears completely. During impact, Captain Turner had stationed Quartermaster Johnston at the ship's wheel, and at 2:12, just 2 minutes after impact, he ordered Johnston to turn the ship hard to starboard, toward the Irish coast, and Johnston confirmed. However, the ship couldn't be stabilized, and she stopped responding to the wheel rapidly. Turner then signaled for the engines to be reversed to stop Lusitania, and the signal was received in the engine room, but nothing could be done. Steam pressure had utterly collapsed from 195 psi before the impact to a pitiful 50 psi and dropping after the fact, meaning she couldn't steer and she couldn't shift gears. She wasn't going to be able to mitigate listing or possibly beach herself, instead pushing forward and hastening her own demise. Immediately, her wireless operator sent out the SOS message, and this was acknowledged by a coastal wireless station. He would then transmit the ship's position just 10 nautical miles south of the old head of Kinsale. 4 minutes into the disaster at 2:14 p.m., all power failed, plunging the belly of the ship into complete darkness. Screams rang out as the ship started to list, and the passengers stumbled in the pitch blackness. Emergency batteries kept radio signals going out for a bit, but all of the elevators stopped working, trapping crew members in the forward cargo hold who'd been prepping luggage to go ashore in Liverpool. These were the seamen tasked with muster stations and launching lifeboats, so this was a significant loss. The bulkhead doors had been closed for safety while traveling in the Irish Sea, and with the power off, they could not be reopened and all the men in these compartments were trapped, drowning where they worked. The rudder was utterly useless at this point, so she couldn't steer whatsoever. There were a few testimonies as well that state passengers were trapped in the two central elevators, with one saloon passenger claiming to have seen them stuck between the boat deck and the deck below while running out the first-class entrance. 1 minute after the power failed, Captain Turner gave the order to abandon ship, with thousands of tons of water flooding the ship's starboard longitudinal compartments, causing a hefty 15-degree list to the starboard side. This list would complicate things for the lifeboats, and we'll get there in a minute, but for the passengers inside, they were now sliding around with the furniture that wasn't bolted down, stumbling around in the dark trying to find their families and a way out. The stairways quickly became bottlenecked with terrified people rushing to get out. There were several infants and children aboard that only added to the commotion with their panicked cries. For those on the lower passenger decks, the confusing and windy corridors in the darkness would be the equivalent of a rat's maze, and the worsening list only added to the confusion. People shoved, shouted, and even pleaded with God for a way out, and some would never make it. As for the lifeboats, the severe starboard list made it incredibly difficult to launch them. In general, lifeboats back then and even now can be safely launched with listing up to 10 degrees, sometimes 15, but anything past that makes it too dangerous. The lifeboats swing into the ship and would drag alongside it, dumping people out. We'll talk about examples of that in a minute. Within the first 5 minutes of Lusitania's sinking, they desperately needed to launch the lifeboats, but she was still moving too fast to safely deploy them. Within the first 6 minutes of the sinking, the forecastle deck began to flood and the bow began to completely submerge. Another agonizing 5 minutes would pass before she was able to start launching lifeboats. Tensions ran high at this point. And we're going to give you a chance to take a quick breather. If you're enjoying this video, leave me a like, subscribe to the channel for more content, and let me know down in the comments section below. Okay, let's continue with the lifeboats. Now the ship was moving slow enough to launch lifeboats, but the list had worsened, and so the starboard side boats swung out so far you couldn't safely step aboard. You could board boats on the port side, but there was no guarantee it would lower properly. Her steel plating was riveted to the side of the ship with large rivets, the tops of which stuck out a full inch, and when the boats on the port side lowered, they would drag and catch on these rivets, threatening to damage or spill the lifeboats entirely before they could reach the water. Because of this, many lifeboats overturned while loading or lowering, sending their passengers plummeting into the cold water below. Some were even overturned by the ship's motion as they hit the water, spilling their occupants out into the sea. The water, by the way, was 52 degrees Fahrenheit and was very cold. This doesn't sound super cold, but the average pool is between 77 to 82 degrees Fahrenheit, so this was a noticeably cold temperature. There are claims that due to negligence of some of Lusitania's officers, some lifeboats crashed down onto the deck, crushing passengers and sliding down toward the bridge, smearing them into the deck. Don't take this as gospel, however, because this claim was disputed by some of the crew and passengers alike. Untrained crewmen having to lower lifeboats by hand would lose their grip on the ropes, sending the lifeboats barreling downward and spilling over. Some lifeboats tipped over as panicked people leapt from the deck to where they thought it was safest. With at least 48 lifeboats, RMS Lusitania had more than enough for her passengers and crew. However, only 6 were successfully launched, and all of them were from the starboard side. Lifeboat 1 had overturned as it was being lowered, spilling the original occupants out, but it righted itself shortly after and filled up with people from the water. Lifeboat 9 launched successfully with 5 people aboard, and Lifeboat 11 launched with 7 people aboard, and they saved swimmers from the water. Lifeboats 13 and 15 were both overloaded with around 150 people, but they safely made it to the water. The final lifeboat to be safely launched was Lifeboat 21, and she was filled with 52 people, just moments before Lusitania would disappear. As the ship sank, a few of her collapsible boats washed off her decks, providing flotation for survivors. Others of her lifeboats were still attached to davits and would be dragged down with her. 2 lifeboats on the port side, although not successfully launched, did clear away from the ship. Lifeboat 14, filled with 11 people, was lowered and launched safely, but her boat plug was not in place, and so she filled with water and sank almost immediately. Lifeboat 2 floated away with new occupants after the original ones had tipped it and fallen out, and had to be cut away from a rope and one of the ship's tentacle-like funnel stays. They rode away just before the final plunge. Schweiger observed hysteria, panic, and total disorder on the starboard side of the deck of RMS Lusitania. By 2:25 p.m., he dropped his periscope and left, having sent Lusitania to the bottom, heading back out to sea. Later in World War I, Schweiger and the crew of U-88 that he was commanding at the time would strike a British sea mine. U-88 would sink on September 5, 1917, north of Terschelling, leaving no survivors. And that was the end for the captain who sank RMS Lusitania. Despite the utter chaos described by the Germans, survivors from the port side of the deck described a calmer scene. According to Charles Laureat, who published his account of the sinking and many other surviving passengers, a few passengers climbed into the early portside lifeboats before being ordered out by Staff Captain James Anderson, who declared confidently, quote, "This ship will not sink." He reassured those around him that the liner had, quote, "touched bottom" and would stay afloat. In all reality of the situation, he'd actually ordered the other crew to wait and fill Lusitania's portside ballast tanks to try and even out the list before lifeboats were to be launched. Unfortunately, the ship would not even out, and therefore few of the lifeboats on the portside launched, and none of them were supervised by Anderson. We've seen the devastation among the crew and passengers. Let's look at Captain Turner. Captain Turner fully expected to go down with Lusitania. He was on deck near the ship's bridge, with the logbook and charts clutched tightly in his fingers when a wave swept upward toward the bridge and the rest of the ship's forward superstructure, and it knocked him off his feet and swept him out away from the ship. He swam over and found a chair floating in the water that he clung to. He did survive, being pulled from the water unconscious after 3 hours floating and clutching to this chair he'd found. His last navigational fix had been only 2 minutes before the torpedoing, and so he remembered the ship's speed and bearing at the moment of the sinking, and it turns out, this was accurate enough to locate RMS Lusitania after the war. Turner was a smart man and a good captain, and this proves it. RMS Lusitania sank 18 minutes after being torpedoed, having traveled 2 nautical miles from the point of impact to her sinking site, and this left a trail of victims and debris in her wake. She sank bow first, rolling over toward the starboard side. Her stern rose up into the air enough to see all 4 of her propellers dripping and gleaming in the sun for a brief moment, before she'd disappear underwater entirely. Her smokestacks didn't collapse like RMS Titanic's did, and as the tips of each of them disappeared under the waves, they created whirlpools that sucked in swimmers and took them down with her. Her masts and rigging were the last things to be seen as she sank. Her bow slammed into the bottom of the ocean at a gentle slope because of her forward momentum as she sank, and she rests about 330 feet underwater. She sank roughly 11.5 nautical miles from the old head of Kinsale, and despite being so close to shore, it took several hours for help to make it from the Irish coast. Local fishermen were among the first boats that arrived, rescuing as many as they could in their small boats. By the time this help had arrived, Lusitania had claimed her victims. Most had gone down with the ship, some had drowned, and some succumbed to the cold waters. By the end of the day on May 7th, 764 passengers and crew were rescued and landed at Queenstown, harrowed by the experience they'd just survived. I really feel for them. Surely they lived with survivor's guilt and trauma for the rest of their lives. The last survivor to pass away was Audrey Warren Lawson Johnston, and she was born in New York City on February 15, 1915. She was one of the infants aboard the ship and would have been just under 3 months when the ship sank. She boarded Lusitania in New York City with her father, Major Frederick Frank Warren Pearl, and her mother, Amy Lee, her 3 siblings, and 2 nurses. Because she was just a tiny baby, of course she has no memory of the disaster. She and her brother Stuart, who was 5 at the time, were saved by their British nursemaid Alice Maud Lynes, who was only 18 at the time, and they jumped off the ship and escaped in a lifeboat. Her mother and father survived, but her 2 sisters, aged 3 and 14 months, perished. She later got married and gifted an inshore lifeboat that she'd named after her mother, the Amy Lee, to New Quay Lifeboat Station in 2004. She died on January 11, 2011 at the age of 95. Rest in peace to her. Now we're going to get into casualties and body recovery. In total, the death toll was absolutely cataclysmic. Of the 1,959 passengers and crew aboard RMS Lusitania at the time of the disaster, 1,199 had been lost. Of the 128 Americans on board, 123 perished. The reason why I mention this is because the outrage of these Americans lost on Lusitania set the spark that would lead the US into World War I. It took a few more ships sinking, but the Americans would join, sharing propaganda stating "Remember the Lusitania" beforehand. Of the 124 children on board, 94 died, including 31 of the 35 infants aboard. Rest in peace to all of the victims. What they went through is unimaginable, and I hope they found solace in the afterlife. In the days after the sinking, Cunard Line offered local fishermen and sea merchants a cash reward for the retrieval of bodies from the Lusitania sinking. Some floated as far away as the Welsh coast. Only 289 bodies were recovered, with 65 of these never identified. The bodies of many of these victims were buried at either Queenstown or Kinsale. In Queenstown, 148 bodies were interred in the Old Church Cemetery. In Kinsale, up to 141 bodies were buried at the Church of St. Maltos. The remaining 885 victims were never recovered. Remember U-20? 2 days prior to sinking RMS Lusitania, they'd sunk Earl of Latham. However, they had allowed the crew to escape in boats. According to cruiser rules and international maritime law, any military vessel stopping an unarmed civilian ship was required to allow passengers and crew to escape before sinking the ship, as we covered last week. However, these rules were made prior to the widespread use of the submarine and didn't take into account the severe risk of a small ship, like a submarine, faced if they gave up the advantage of a surprise attack. Schweiger could have allowed the passengers and crew of Lusitania to escape first, but he ran the risk of being rammed or attacked by deck guns if she had them, and he found this risk to be too great to spare any lives. Merchant ships had been advised to ram a U-boat if it surfaced, and a cash bonus was offered to any ship that sank a U-boat. HMT Olympic of the White Star Line, Titanic's older sister, was actually successful in ramming and sinking SMU 103 in the English Channel, which makes her an instant badass. According to a few researchers, RMS Lusitania was traveling without a flag flying and with her name obscured slightly with darkish dye. This contradicts other researchers and Schweiger's logbook entries, so take this with a massive grain of salt. An urban legend is persistent with the story that we need to discredit. They catch traction, and some people still insist on it being true, but I'm here to tell you, it's utterly false. The story goes that when Schweiger gave the order to fire, his quartermaster, Charles Vogel, refused to take part in the attack because there were women and children aboard Lusitania, so he refused to pass the order along to the torpedo room. This would result in his court-martialing and imprisonment at Kiel until the end of World War I. This rumor came about when a letter written to the editor of the French daily newspaper Le Monde was published in 1972. Despite the fact that this has been squashed by researchers 10 times over, Vogel's alleged heroism was still on full display in the torpedoing scene of the 2007 docudrama Sinking of the Lusitania, Terror at Sea. There are many interesting, noteworthy folks that both died and survived on RMS Lusitania, but one in particular caught my eye. A 59-year-old man named Frank Tower. Frank Lucky Tower was a stoker on RMS Lusitania who claimed to have survived the sinkings of RMS Titanic, RMS Empress of Ireland, and RMS Lusitania. There is no evidence to show that anyone was involved in all three, let alone this man. Frank Tower survived the sinking of RMS Lusitania, and one man did survive both RMS Titanic and RMS Empress of Ireland, and his name was William Clark. Probably not true, but very interesting all the same. While that story isn't true, the love of our patrons is absolutely true. This episode couldn't be possible without our lovely patrons. Thank you all so much. If you'd like to support the channel and future episodes, go to patreon.com/shipwrecksunday to join. Alright, let's get into the inquiries and aftermath. There are 3 main inquiries and investigations we have to cover. The first is from the Cork County Coroner, the second is from the official Board of Trade investigation, and the third is the American court proceedings. Americans died in the sinking, so of course there was going to be some sort of proceedings over the pond. Let's start with the Cork County Coroner and see what he dug up. On May 8, 1915, local coroner for Kinsale and Cork County, John Hogan, opened an inquest into the deaths of 2 males and 3 females whose bodies had been brought ashore by the local boat Heron. Most of the survivors and dead were taken to Queenstown, since that was closer, but these 5 ended up on Hogan's table, and he was bewildered by what had happened to them. On May 10th, Captain Turner gave evidence as to the events of the sinking, including the single torpedo and subsequent second explosion. He acknowledged that he'd received general warnings about submarines, but he'd not been informed of the sinking of Earl of Latham. He was not permitted to discuss his orders from the Admiralty, but he stated he'd followed them. The coroner came to the verdict that the deceased men and women had drowned after an attack on an unarmed, non-combatant ship contrary to international law. It gets a little messy here because half an hour after the inquest had concluded and the results were handed to the press, the Crown Solicitor for Cork, Harry Wynne, arrived with instructions to halt it. Awkward. Captain Turner was not to give evidence, nor statements should be made about the instructions given to ships about avoiding submarines. That concludes the Cork County Coroner's investigation. Moving on to the Board of Trade investigation. This was presided over by Rec Commissioner Lord Mersey, and it took place in the Westminster Central Hall from June 15th to the 18th of 1915. This would be extended with more sessions at the Westminster Palace Hotel on July 1st and Caxton Hall on July 17th. Lord Mersey didn't have a background in maritime law, instead having a background in commercial shipping. However, he'd presided over numerous important maritime investigations, namely that of RMS Titanic. He had 4 assessors with him, Lieutenant Commander Hearn, Admiral Sir Frederick Inglefield, and 2 merchant navy captains, D. Davies and J. Spedding. The Board of Trade was represented by the Attorney General Sir Edward Carson and the Solicitor General F.E. Smith. Butler Aspinall had represented the Board of Trade at the Titanic inquiry, and he was retained here to represent Cunard Line. 36 witnesses were called, with Lord Mersey wondering why more witnesses weren't called. For example, at Titanic's British inquiry, nearly 100 witnesses gave testimony. Most of the inquiry sessions were open to the public, but the sessions held on June 15th and 18th were in camera, a fancy legal term that means in private. This is when evidence regarding the ship's navigation was presented. Since this was wartime, they wanted to preserve as much military strategy as possible. The Cork County Coroner had already said too much. Written statements were collected from all of the remaining crew, and they were presented to the inquiry on standard forms in identical handwriting with similar phrasing to keep things fair. This wasn't a perfect process, however, especially when we hear what Quartermaster Johnston had to say. He said he felt pressured to remain loyal to Cunard, and it had been suggested that their case would be helped by him stating there were 2 torpedoes, not 1. When giving evidence to the tribunal, he was not asked about torpedoes or their number. Other witnesses who stated there was only 1 torpedo were not permitted to testify. In contrast to his statement for the Cork County Coroner, Captain Turner stated there were 2 torpedoes. In 1933, in an interview, he'd revert back to his original statement of only 1 torpedo. Most witnesses that testified claimed there were 2 torpedoes, and some said 3, with a possible second submarine involved. This is significant because confusion on the number of torpedoes remains to this day, and it definitely muddies the water for this official inquiry. They weren't looking for the truth, they were covering their asses. So much so they didn't even let Clement Edwards, representing the Seamen's Union, introduce evidence about which watertight compartments had been involved. The Navy had the audacity to try and pin this whole thing on Captain Turner, crying negligence. This whole thing just angers me endlessly. It started with Vice Admiral Koch, who was commanding the Navy at Queenstown. He reported that, quote, the ship was especially warned that submarines were active on south coast and to keep mid-channel course avoiding headlands. Also, position of submarine off Cape Clear at 10 o'clock was communicated by W/T to her. This may have been true, but they definitely failed to communicate the sinking of Earl of Latham, so who knows what else they forgot. Anyways, these hoity-toity men of the higher-ups continued spinning their web of lies to protect themselves. Captain Webb, director of the Trade Division, started on a dossier of signals sent to Lusitania which Turner might have failed to observe. That could be for a number of reasons, mind you. In the case of the Titanic disaster, some ice warnings never left the wireless room, so who knows what went on into Lusitania's wireless room. I'm not saying Captain Turner is perfect. He surely made his mistakes, and mistakes were made with Lusitania sinking. However, he was the man who was there and who was actually trying to find the truth, so he's the most reliable narrator we have here. First Sea Lord Fisher noted on one document submitted by Webb for review stating, quote, "As the Cunard Company would not have employed an incompetent man, it's a certainty that Captain Turner is not a fool, but a knave. I hope that Turner will be arrested immediately after the inquiry, whatever the verdict." First Lord Winston Churchill, yes, that Winston Churchill, stated, quote, "I consider the Admiralty's case against Turner should be pressed by a skillful counsel, and that Captain Webb should attend as a witness, if not employed as an assessor. We will pursue the captain without check." These two may have been buddying up together to get Captain Turner, however, they would take the L on this one, luckily. Both men were replaced in their positions before the inquiry because of the failures of the Gallipoli campaign. Karma came around and nipped them right in the bud. Here's where Captain Turner might have messed up, but I can't really blame the man. Part of the proceedings turned on the question of proper evasive tactics against submarines. Captain Turner was told he hadn't complied with Admiralty instructions to travel at high speed, keep away from shore, and maintain a zigzag course. Naval instructions about zigzagging were read to the captain, and he confirmed he'd received them, but the instructions he heard here were not the same ones he received before the sinking. Of course they wouldn't be. The regulations quoted had been approved on April 25th, after Lusitania had arrived in New York City, and were distributed on May 13th, after Lusitania was well underwater. Their communication is as bad as a corporation, my friends. Lusitania had only slowed to 15 knots because of fog, but otherwise she was maintaining a steady 18 knots near Ireland, and this was much faster than all but 9 other ships in the British merchant fleet, and double the speed of a submerged submarine. He could have maintained 21 knots, but he did not because he was ordered to come into Liverpool on high tide and was timing the arrival for that. At the time, no ship before Lusitania had been torpedoed when traveling at faster than 15 knots. He was plenty offshore in my opinion. Lusitania was 13 nautical miles away when she was struck, though the inquiry was claiming he was only 8 nautical miles away. And to add on to this, the ships being censured were ones traveling closer than 5 nautical miles from shore. They were being unnecessarily hard on Captain Turner simply because they needed a fall guy. As you can tell, I'm a bit peeved. This whole thing has been a mess. Instead of finding the truth and providing answers, this whole thing has been about covering up one singular torpedo and the ammunition stored on Lusitania. Turner did clap back. He had discussed the matter of what course the ship should take with his 2 most senior officers, Captain Anderson and Chief Officer Piper, and sadly, neither of them survived to corroborate this. The 3 had agreed that the Admiralty's warning of, quote, submarine activity 20 miles south of Coningbé overrode other Admiralty advice to keep to, quote, mid-channel, which was where the submarine was. So he changed course at 12:40 p.m., intending to get closer to land and take a course north of the reported submarine. It makes sense to me, honestly. If this wasn't messy enough for you, well, here you go. F.E. Smith tried to press a point he was making by quoting from a signal sent to British ships. Lord Mersey was confused because this message was in the version of evidence given only to Smith by the Board of Trade solicitor, Sir Ellis Cunliffe, but not in anyone else's versions. Cunliffe tried to explain away the discrepancy by stating that different versions of the paper had been prepared for use depending upon whether or not the inquiry was open to the public. However, the message in question never existed. Lord Mersey was annoyed by this and stated that it was his job to find the truth, and from that point forward he was more critical of the Admiralty evidence. I would be too. This whole thing seemed cooked from the get-go. On June 10th, there was a big whammy set on this case before it even started. Significant changes were made to the Defense of the Realm Act of 1914, and it made it an offense to collect or publish information about the nature, carriage, or use of war materials for any reason. Originally, this only applied if the information was given to the enemy, but now everyone was fair game. This was used to prohibit discussion about Lusitania's precious cargo. The rifle cartridges hidden on RMS Lusitania were mentioned during the case, with Lord Mersey stating that, quote, the 5,000 cases of ammunition on board were 50 yards away from where the torpedo struck the ship. Because of the insistence of Joseph Marshall, who was threatening to sue Cunard for their poor handling of the sinking, there was another hearing on July 1st. Marshall testified that the second explosion had sounded like the rattling of a machine gun being fired and appeared to be coming from below the second-class dining room at the rear of the ship. He had been sitting in this dining room when it went off. It would make sense if a bunch of rifle cartridges started going off. However, the British government was keen on protecting themselves, so they dug into his background, distorted the information, and leaked it to the press to discredit him. Captain Turner, Cunard Line, and the Royal Navy were absolved of any negligence, and all of the blame was placed on the German government. Lord Mersey stated that he believed that Captain Turner, quote, exercised his judgment for the best, and that the blame for the sinking, quote, must rest solely with those who plotted and with those who committed the crime. For the most part, I'd agree with that. The British government or whoever was responsible for putting ammunition on that ship should take a small portion of the blame as well, in my opinion. 2 days after closing the inquiry, Lord Mersey waived his fees for the case and formally retired. It must have been really embarrassing to him because of how royally screwed up all of the evidence was. His final statement on the case was, quote, the Lusitania case was a damned dirty business. I feel that's an accurate assessment. The full report has never been released to the public, even after 100 years, though a copy was thought to exist amongst Lord Mersey's personal papers, but even after his death, they've never been recovered. This concludes the British inquiry, which was a mess from the start. Let's see how the Americans do. The Defense of the Realm Act was invoked so that British witnesses could not give evidence on any subject the American court proceedings covered, so it's off to a rough start already. There were statements collected in Queenstown after the sinking by the American consul Wesley Frost, but they were never produced. This lawsuit came about because in the United States, 67 claims for compensation were lodged against Cunard Line, and these were all heard in 1918 before the United States District Court for the Southern District of New York. The judge that presided over the Titanic inquiry, Judge Julius Mayer, was in charge, and last time he'd ruled in favor of White Star Line. He was conservative or right-winged, and he was known as a safe pair of hands with matters of national interest. His favorite thing to say to lawyers is definitely something I'm stealing from my personal life, and it's, quote, come to the point. This case would not have a jury, and both sides agreed that they weren't going to question the rifle cartridges or rumors of troops on RMS Lusitania, or if she was armed. There were 33 witnesses called that were not capable of traveling to the U.S., so they gave their statements in English to Commissioner R.V. Wynne, and that was passed along. The evidence used in Lord Mersey's case was considered, but anything in the closed sessions wasn't. After the horrific way he was judged in Britain and the poor handling of that case, you can't blame Captain Turner for being more defensive in his testimony here. He argued that up until the time of the sinking, he had no reason to think that zigzagging in a fast ship would be effective, and in fact, he'd commanded a different ship that sank while zigzagging. Evidence from other captains bolstered this anecdotal evidence, and he stated that before Lusitania sank, no merchant ship zigzagged. He argued that he had to keep a steady course for at least 30 minutes to get an accurate 4-point bearing and precisely confirm Lusitania's position. He did get flack on this point because other captains refuted, stating that a 2-point bearing would have taken 5 minutes and been accurate enough. There were several witnesses that stated there were open portholes on the ship when she sank, and an expert witness was called in. This expert explained that portholes the same size as the ones on Lusitania could allow in 4 tons of water per minute if they were just 3 feet under the water. Again, testimony on the number of torpedoes was cloudy, and where it struck was also debated amongst witnesses. The nature of the dangerous cargo was considered, but experts stated that under no circumstances would these casings have exploded. There's a record that shows that crewman Jack Roper wrote to Cunard in 1919, requesting expenses for his testimony that made the line look better as dictated by Cunard. Bad look for Cunard all around. Finally, a verdict would come through. On August 23, 1918, Mayer's judgment would read that, quote, "The cause of the sinking was the illegal act of the Imperial German government, that there'd been 2 torpedoes, and that Captain Turner had acted appropriately and emergency procedures had been up to snuff." He ruled that further claims for compensation should not be addressed to Cunard, but instead to the German government. The Germans would end up forking over $2.5 million in 1925 for the Lusitania incident. We know the legal tea, we know what happened with her sinking, but there's still more controversy for us to dig through. Her wreck. Her wreck rests on her starboard side at an angle of about 30 degrees in 305 feet of water. Her wreck looks like it was stepped on, and if you're wondering why, there's a reason. It's actually heavily debated, which is where the controversy comes in. There's a misconception that she was used by the British Navy for depth charge practices or accidentally blown up when mistaken for a U-boat, but this is untrue. There's no damage from explosives on the main body of the ship, and most of the damage is simply from being laid on her side and not being as beefy as HMHS Britannic, which is relatively intact for being on her side. This was proven by an expedition in the 60s that showed that she was in relatively good condition and had no damage from underwater explosions. Lusitania has slowly collapsed with gravity and the rough currents in the area, causing her to look squashed. There were explosives used with her wreck, though, and we cannot discredit that. 3 of her 4 propellers were blown off by artifact hunters in the 1980s, and this caused extensive damage to the stern. Cutting and blasting had happened throughout the ship over time because of those looking to take things from her wreck as well, causing more damage to the ship and hastening her disappearance. Her superstructure is essentially gone, and she's left a heap of scrap metal. She's also draped in hundreds of fishing nets from being in a heavily fished area. It's disappointing since she was such an iconic beauty afloat, and those who perished aboard her deserve a much better resting place. But the only thing we can do now is try to protect what is left of the wreck and continue telling her story as to preserve the memories of her victims. RMS Lusitania was a beautiful, innovative ocean liner that opened doors for so many British four-stackers, including RMS Titanic, who dwarfs her in popularity. It's a shame that not more know of RMS Lusitania and her sinking. Her victims deserve recognition and remembrance. Rest in peace to the victims of the Lusitania disaster. May they rest easy. If you liked that story and wanted to hear something similar, check out our episode last week on the building of RMS Lusitania. Stay tuned next week for the story of RMS Mauretania and her career from start to finish. Thank you for tuning into Shipwreck Sunday, have a great week, and we'll see you next time.